And so today begins our first unit in grade 11 biology, and I'm going to be talking to you about the diversity of living things. That is our first unit. And so in this unit, I'm going to be introducing you to the broad array of organisms that exist on our lovely planet and all of their crazy, interesting, amazing characteristics. So the first topic in this course is identifying, naming, and classifying species. So in a similar way to that we classify, let's say, for instance, the clothes that are in our closet, there are varying ways to classify those clothes. We can organize them, let's say, by color. We might want to organize them by item or by season, and so on and so forth. There are very specific and differing ways that we classify species that live on our planet. So I want you to take a minute and I want you to think about, well, what does it mean for an organism to be a species, right? For it to be its own species, right? So take a minute, just think about what that might mean or how you might explain that to somebody else. Well, in science, the consensus is that we define a species as a group of organisms that can reproduce to produce fertile offspring. Okay? So, for instance, what makes a species distinct from another species is that when the two organisms within the species mate, that their offspring can also reproduce as well. So, for instance, we may see situations where organisms in a particular species might try to breed with another species, but unless their offspring is fertile, then those two organisms are not considered to be the same species. So some interesting facts. So to date, scientists have learned that have identified 2 million species on our planet. Right? Now, so that seems like quite a bit. But having said that, we also recognize that there are some limitations in the world of science in terms of what can be identified. So scientists currently estimate that there are approximately 5 to 20 million different species that exist on our planet. So then, why the discrepancy? Why are we seeing a difference here between the number of species that we've identified and the number of species that might actually exist? So I want you to take a minute and think about that. So some reasons that you might be contemplating would be, well, this planet is pretty vast. It's huge. And so there are many, many different areas that scientists have yet to discover. So I'm thinking like some really isolated parts of our planet. Or perhaps, deep in our oceans, maybe, the depths beyond which we are able to explore effectively.
Good morning, everyone.
And so another possibility is that, maybe some of these organisms are beyond detection. There's a time where we really didn't know about the existence of bacteria, right? And so perhaps there are organisms that are existing here on our planet that we're not even able to perceive due to the limitations of technology. Okay, so next question. Why do we even care about all this, right? Why are we interested in knowing and classifying and identifying new species? Why does that matter to us? Well, certainly from the perspective of biologists, you can see that is an interest for them, and so aside from practical reasons, biologists may just want to basically be interested in studying these organisms, so why not classify them? But it's not, the reality is that, identifying species is important to all of us. For instance, farmers might need to be able to identify the weeds that are growing in their fields next to their crops so that they can effectively manage the growth of that weed, right? You want to be able to identify what it is so that you can manage it properly. If you were a physician, you would need to be able to identify maybe the type of bacteria that is infecting your patient and assign an appropriate medication for that. And of course, if you're looking at Western medicine versus Eastern medicine, sort of Chinese medicine utilizes a lot of natural species in order to help people. And so being able to effectively identify and classify species is going to be really, really important. And so I want to go back to the idea, the whole classifying and organizing clothes in your closet, right? So, I talked about how there's certainly several ways that we can kind of organize the clothes in our closet, and none of them are necessarily wrong, though some of them may be more practical for particular purposes. And so I think it's important for us to know that there is some disagreement about how to classify species, even in the world of science. And so there are several different what we call species concepts that help us to categorize or classify organisms living on our planet, but in different ways. And so that's what we're going to talk about today. The first is called the morphological species concept. The second is a biological. And the last one is phylogenetic. And so we're going to explore those ideas, differentiate them for you. I'm going to talk about the pros and the cons of each different method of classifying living things. All right, so our first concept is the morphological species concept. So it's important for you to understand, well, what is morphology? Morphology is a whole area of science, biology, where we're basically looking at differences in the body, the shape, the size, and other structural features of organisms. So that is how we're going to be classifying these organisms based on the shape of their body, their type of body, their size, and maybe some colorations and so on. So a morphological species concept is going to organize species based on these features. So I have a little diagram here. Let me see. All right, here we go. I'm going to expand this window just a smidge. And so for these butterflies that we're looking at here, or moths, we could basically, when we look at the differences between these organisms, we can see varying ways to classify them, right? So we might be able to classify species based on the size of their wings. That would be a morphological way of classifying a species, right? So I want you to take a close look at this picture here. And here we can see several different species of this particular I'm not sure if it's a butterfly or a moth. It's kind of hard to tell. And so I want you to examine, well, what might be some challenges with the morphological species concept? What are some challenges that you might perceive here? Certainly some benefits of this concept is that it's very, we're using some characteristics that are fairly easy to kind of see. It doesn't require a lot of technology. We're simply using our senses to help us with this. But what I see here is, well, where do we draw the line, right? So what distinguishes, certainly there's a big difference between this organism versus this one down here. Those are more easily distinguishable. But when I look at, these neighboring organisms, like at what point do we decide one is too different from the other to be considered the same species? So certainly a pro with the morphological species concept is that it's a super simple way of classifying. Doesn't require any high-tech materials. But it is limited in that it is difficult to decide where to draw the line. If all we're looking at is those physical characteristics, then we can see how that could be super subjective. So, at what point does too much difference constitute, how much difference constitutes too much variation to be able to kind of place these organisms in the same category? So that, it's super simple to use, but it's also maybe a little bit subjective. And so next is the biological species concept, and I think this is the one that most scientists sort of lean towards And when we talk about species, this is the one that comes to mind. So this classification is based on whether two organisms can produce fertile offspring. So going back to that initial species definition. So for example, you know, a male donkey and a female horse, when they mate, create a mule. And so the male donkey, the donkey is a species, and a horse on its own is a species. But in reality, the mule is not a species. And the reason for that is that mules are typically infertile. So if a mule survives to the point where it can be born, then it will be sterile. So in other words, one mule, like a male mule, can't go out and mate with another female mule and produce any offspring. They will be infertile. So for that reason, a mule is not considered to be a species. Let's take a look at this, right? And so if we have a horse and we have a donkey, right? Male donkey, female horse, that produces a mule. And the mule is great because it has some great characteristics of each of these organisms. The mule is what we call a hybrid organism because it has characteristics of two other species together. So it has that sort of strength that the donkey would have and stability, but it also has some of the characteristics of the horse. Interestingly enough, if you take a female donkey and a male horse, you produce what's called a hinny. And so a hinny, let me see if I can find a picture. So I'm going to try to find a picture of a hinny here and get back to you. So whereas, you know, I'm going to go, here's a picture of a hinny. I'm going to go back for a second to our other note. Oops, here we go. Where was I? Here. There we go. So, you know, when we look at a mule is said to have the extremities of a donkey, so shorter legs, but the body of a horse, right? But if we look at a hinny, let me go back over here, hinny, here we go. So the hinny has a body of a mule, but the extremities of a horse. So it's like this tall, sort of skinny, odd-looking organism. And so the mule is much more well-suited to certain tasks that require a lot of strength. And the hinny is just sort of an odd-looking, misproportioned organism. Okay. So, but there are also other organisms. You've probably, if you've watched Napoleon Dynamite, you've probably heard of a liger and a tigon, or a liger, but there's also a tigon. So let's look at some pictures of those hybrid organisms. So here is a picture of a liger, and so a liger is a hybrid organism that would typically be infertile, but that's what happens when you have a male lion mate with a female tiger, right? And you can see the characteristics of both. You have that sort of heavy built body of the lion, but some of the coloration of the tiger. And so, yeah, so it's a hybrid organism. So that is our biological species concept. So just to recap, we have our morphological species concept, which is based on the body structure and physical appearance. When we look at the biological species concept, then we're talking about which species can interbreed and successfully produce fertile offspring. And so we're going to examine what some of the pros and cons are of this biological species concept. So some of the pros are that it's commonly used. Most people are familiar with it. And we can also easily sort of identify whether that's something that works, right? But the cons are that it can't be applied in all cases, right? So in some cases, we can't really use it because there might be a physical separation of species, and so we don't know whether they would actually mate, right? So in a natural environment, we really can't apply this concept in all cases. Also, some species of organisms don't reproduce by sexual means with a male and a female sex cells coming together. Some species reproduce asexually, and so how do we manage and classify organisms that don't reproduce in a sexual manner, right? So it's limited from that perspective as well. Okay, so definitely most commonly used, but we can't really apply it to everything, and so it doesn't work as a means of classifying species that don't reproduce sexually.